Every Thursday morning without fail, he books 2 seats on the 0940 coastal train, yet he always boards alone. No one knows his name, no one ever sees a second passenger. He waits at the same weathered bench by platform 3, holding 2 tickets in one trembling hand and a flask of tea in the other, as if time is frozen around him. Some say he's just lonely, others believe he's lost. But what if it's neither? Welcome to Echoes of Kindness, where quiet rituals speak louder than words, and sometimes the most ordinary acts carry the weight of extraordinary love. Stay with us. You're about to uncover a promise that never left the platform. Ellen moved to the town in winter, not because she loved the sea, but because she needed somewhere quieter than London to forget how loud her life had once been. Most mornings she barely spoke a word. Not from sadness, at least not entirely, but from a certain kind of tiredness that doesn't show on the face, only in the way someone holds a cup or how they linger just a little too long in silence. She was in her early 60s, recently retired from a library job where even the books had stopped speaking to her. No husband, no children, a brother she hadn't heard from in years. Her neighbors in the coastal town were polite, but distant, the kind of people who wave through windows, but never knock on doors. On Thursdays, Ellen walked to the station, not to travel, but to sit. The little cafe by the platform served weak tea and overcooked scones, but it had one thing she couldn't find anywhere else: anonymity. It was here, behind a rain-flecked window, that she first noticed the old man. He was impossible to miss once you'd seen him, stooped, slow, always layered in a brown wool coat, no matter the weather. He never looked at his phone, never read. He simply sat facing the tracks, 2 tickets folded neatly on his knee, one for him, one for someone else. At first, Ellen thought nothing of it. Maybe he was forgetful. Maybe someone canceled last minute. But then she saw him again. And again. Same man, same bench, same train, same empty space beside him. And something about that space spoke to her. You see, Ellen wasn't just watching him. She was seeing him in the way only people who've been alone too long can see each other, because she too had known what it meant to wait for someone who would never come, to press replay on a memory so often that it wore thin, like old cassette tape. Her flat overlooked the sea, but the curtains stayed closed most days. She didn't like the way the light shifted too fast. It made time feel slippery. There was a photo on her shelf of a younger woman holding a baby, though Ellen never mentioned who they were. She dusted it regularly, almost reverently, but never smiled at it. That too was a kind of ritual. At the station, she always chose the corner table. From there, she could see the man arrive, settle, and wait, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, as though he was looking for something in the air. Not on the tracks. She never spoke to him, never waved. But once their eyes met, and in that instant, something passed between them. Not recognition, not friendship, something quieter. A kind of truce between two people who'd each made their peace with silence. Ellen began returning every Thursday. She told herself it was for the routine. But deep down, there was a question she wasn't ready to ask out loud. What was he waiting for? And why did it feel like part of her was waiting too? Whatever his reasons. Ellen knew one thing for certain. This man wasn't just clinging to the past. He was honoring it. And though her own grief was buried deep, his presence stirred something in her. An ache that was more memory than pain. A longing not for what was lost, but for the love that once made it matter. And so she watched. Because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones we need to hear the most. The first Thursday of December arrived colder than usual. A thin frost clung to the railings of the station, and the sea beyond the tracks thrashed against the rocks in restless rhythm. Ellen wrapped her scarf twice around her neck and tucked her gloved hands into her coat pockets as she made her usual way down the hill, her breath misting in the pale morning light. She hadn't meant to care. Truly, she hadn't. But that morning as she reached the platform cafe, something felt off. The bench on platform 3 was empty. At first, she thought she might have simply missed him, that perhaps he had taken an earlier train or chosen another day, but the cafe clock read 09:26. He was never early, never late. The 0940 train was always his. Ellen sat by the window as always, her tea cooling untouched. She watched the platform as though watching a stage without its actor. Something inside her tightened. Not panic exactly, but a kind of hollowing out. And then she saw him. He appeared from the far end of the station, walking slower than usual, leaning heavily on the rail. His coat was askew, his gait unsteady. For the first time, he looked not just old but fragile, breakable. She stood without thinking, knocking over her tea. By the time she reached the platform, he had just reached the bench. He sat down with a sigh so deep it seemed to echo under the iron roof. 2 tickets were in his hand, but they slipped through his fingers and fluttered to the ground like withered leaves. She picked them up. The ink was smudged slightly from damp. Same train, same time, 2 seats, and then without warning, the man collapsed sideways, his body folding like paper. There was a shout from a nearby passenger. Footsteps, a flurry of motion. Someone called for an ambulance. Someone else fetched a station staff member. Ellen knelt beside him, heart thudding. His breathing was shallow but steady, his skin pale beneath the gray of his stubble. His coat was open now, and something peeked from the inside pocket. Not the tickets, those she still held, but a worn photograph, its edges curled from years of being carried. It showed a young woman laughing, dark hair, eyes full of mischief. She stood beside a seaside carousel, one hand raised as if waving or perhaps letting go. On the back in careful handwriting were 3 words and a date: Agnes, 1962. Ellen's fingers tightened around the photo without meaning to. The paramedics arrived minutes later. The old man was conscious but disoriented. He was gently lifted onto a stretcher, his head turning faintly toward Ellen as if searching for something. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, no recognition. But something softer, almost like apology. She handed over the tickets and photograph to one of the paramedics, then hesitated. The coat is still folded beside the bench. Ellen picked it up, clutching it to her chest like something sacred, unsure why she felt compelled to take it with her. She didn't know his name, she couldn't follow him to the hospital, but something about the way he looked at her, through her, unlocked a door she hadn't touched in years. That night, in her small flat above the bakery, she laid the coat across a chair and sat beside it as though waiting for it to speak. She took out the photo again, studied the handwriting: Agnes. She'd never heard the name before, but it rang in her chest like a bell in fog. Who was she? A daughter? A sister? A love? Or a ghost? As she slid her hand back into the coat's inner pocket, she felt something else tucked deeper inside. A postcard yellowed with time. The ink faded but legible. Still Thursday. Still waiting. A no address, no date. Just those 6 words. Ellen stared at it for a long time, her thumb running over the curve of the handwriting. It was beautiful. Old-fashioned and intentional. She couldn't sleep that night. Not from worry, but from need. A need she couldn't quite name. Only follow the next morning, she returned to the station. She asked the cafe girl if she knew the man. She didn't. Neither did the ticket attendant. But the older woman who ran the tiny flower kiosk near the entrance tilted her head when Ellen showed her the photo. "Oh, that's Charles," she said. "He's been coming here since before I started, and I've been here 28 years. Do you know who Agnes is?" Ellen asked, barely trusting her voice. The woman frowned gently, eyes drifting toward the bench. "I think she was someone he was meant to meet once. A long time ago, and he never stopped coming." The florist shook her head. Not once. Ellen thanked her quietly and walked away, her heart suddenly full of more questions than she could carry. That evening, as the wind howled against her window, Ellen unfolded the postcard again and placed it next to her kettle. She made tea for 2 out of habit, or maybe hope, and sat across from an empty chair. She wasn't sure what she meant to do next. Only that she had already crossed a threshold. She had touched the edges of a story that didn't belong to her, and yet now somehow it did. The next Thursday she returned to the station. Same time, same bench. But Charles wasn't there, only the wind and the distant sound of gulls, and the memory of 2 tickets held in a trembling hand. Ellen sat down anyway, not because she expected him to appear, but because she needed to be near the place where something had shifted, where he had shifted her. And though she didn't yet know how or why Ellen knew this much, she couldn't go back to the woman she was before the fall. Ellen hadn't intended to become involved. That was never her way. For most of her life, she had been a background presence, content to observe, rarely to intervene. But something about Charles and the way he had collapsed like a paper figure folding in on years of quiet waiting had pierced through a layer of armor she hadn't realized she still wore. She returned to the station every Thursday, not out of routine but out of necessity. The absence of the old man had left a strange echo behind, and Ellen found herself listening to it more carefully than she'd ever listened to any living person. Each week she came armed with questions, but no answers arrived. She'd ask around discreetly, politely, but most people simply shrugged. The girl at the cafe began recognizing her and offered a faint smile but didn't seem to know anything beyond the pastries. It was only the florist Margaret, as Ellen learned, who remembered fragments, bits and pieces, a name here, a gesture there. He never spoke much, Margaret said one morning as she rearranged daffodils in a cracked ceramic vase. But once, maybe 10 years ago, I asked if he was waiting for someone. He just nodded, said, "She's always late, but I don't mind." Did he ever mention her name? Not to me, but he did leave a note once I saw it on the bench, just a scrap of paper weighed down by a penny. It said, "I've kept your seat." Margaret looked down at the flowers, her voice softening. I never threw it away. That night, Ellen couldn't sleep again. Her flat was too quiet and the tick of the clock too loud. She took out the postcard again. Still Thursday. Still waiting. She ran her fingers over the worn handwriting. Her mind looped with questions. Who was Agnes really? Why had Charles waited for so long, for decades it seemed, for someone who never came? And then, almost without thinking, she opened her laptop and searched the only clue she had. Agnes, 1962. It was barely enough to narrow down anything. But Ellen was a librarian by trade and old habits die hard. She searched archives, looked into local history, dug through the digital remnants of a town that had long forgotten the names written in its margins. Hours passed, days. On the fourth Thursday without Charles, Ellen found something. A record buried in the files of a care home that no longer existed. Agnes Weatherby, resident from 1989 to 1992. Deceased. No next of kin. There was no photograph, no obituary, only a name and a note, left no known possessions, no visitors recorded. Something tightened in Ellen's chest as she read the words again. No visitors. But that couldn't be true. If Charles had been waiting, he must have known where she was, or had he? The following week, Ellen visited the site where the care home had once stood. It was now a gravel car park behind a supermarket. Nothing remained, no plaque, no sign, no memory. But across the road stood a church, small and sun-worn, with ivy climbing its brick face. Inside, she found an elderly priest who remembered the care home, and vaguely an Agnes. She was quiet, he said, eyes narrowed as if searching through fog. Always wore blue, walked with a cane. The staff said she sometimes sat by the window whispering someone's name. Did she have family? He shook his head. No one visited her that I remember. Except once, a man. Tall gray coat, didn't say much. Left a postcard on her windowsill. Ellen felt the hairs on her neck stand. She thanked the priest and left the winter wind wrapping around her like a question. She knew then what she had to do. She went to the hospital. The receptionist was kind but firm. "We don't give out patient information, I'm afraid." But Ellen didn't give up. She returned the next day. And the next. On the fourth visit, she brought a copy of the photograph and said softly, "I'm not family, but I believe I might be the only one who's been looking for him." That seemed to matter. Charles had been discharged 2 weeks ago. No forwarding address, no emergency contact, but the nurse said he left behind something you might want to see. It was a notebook. Old edges frayed, no name on the front. Ellen took it home and placed it gently on the kitchen table. For a long while, she didn't open it. She made tea, swept the floor, reorganized her spice cupboard. Then finally she sat down and began to read. Chatterum. The notebook was part journal, part letter, part confessional. It wasn't written for anyone in particular, or perhaps it was written for Agnes or even himself as a way of not forgetting after page. It told a story of a seaside romance in 1962, a love that began on a carousel, flourished in secret, and ended in a whisper. They were young. She was engaged to another man. He had just returned from military service. They met every Thursday at the same platform bench, planning to run away together. But one day she didn't come. Weeks passed, then months. And finally he received a letter from her sister. Agnes had been placed in a care facility after a fall. Her memory had begun to unravel. He came once, tried to see her, but she didn't recognize him, called him a stranger, asked him to leave, so he did. But he never stopped coming back to the bench. Not to wait for her, he wrote. But to keep the promise, the notebook ended with a line that made Ellen cover her mouth to hold the sound inside her chest. Love is not just meeting someone. Sometimes it's showing up when no one else will. Ellen cried quietly, not the sobs of drama, but the slow leaking kind of grief that comes from recognizing your own reflection in someone else's sorrow. because now she understood Charles hadn't been waiting for Agnes to return. He had been waiting to remember her properly, to not let time rub out her name. And Ellen, who had spent so many years trying to forget the child she once carried and lost the partner who left the family, who drifted, now felt something shift inside her. She wanted to remember again, even the painful things, especially the painful things. The next Thursday, Ellen brought the notebook to platform 3. She placed it gently on the bench beside her and sat with her hands folded in her lap. Across the tracks, gulls circled above the tide. The wind was sharp and full of salt. Someone stopped to glance at the notebook, but no one picked it up. Ellen stayed until the 0940 pulled in. She didn't board, just watched as people came and went, each carrying their own ghosts, their own unanswered letters. She didn't know where Charles was now, but she knew this much. He had waited long enough for someone, and now perhaps it was her turn. Ellen hadn't intended to return to the care home site again. The gravel car park held nothing but silence now, and she had already traced every clue, turned every stone, or so she had thought. But something had been bothering her since reading Charles's final words in the notebook, the way he spoke of keeping the promise, as though there was more to it than waiting. So on a Tuesday morning, when the sky was bruised with low clouds and the sea air carried the smell of coming rain, Ellen stood once again at the edge of the car park, staring at the empty ground. Her fingers were clenched in her coat pockets, the notebook tucked under her arm. She didn't know what she was hoping to find. Perhaps it was foolish, but when a man loses 30 years to a memory, the least she could do was not give up after 4 weeks. Across the street, the same small church sat tucked behind overgrown hedges. This time she stepped inside. The air was thick with incense and old wood. A new priest stood at the front, adjusting hymnals. He looked younger, perhaps mid-40s, with tired eyes but a gentle voice. "I'm looking for records," Ellen said softly. "For someone named Agnes Weatherby?" He blinked at the name, then motioned to follow him through a narrow hallway lined with filing cabinets. "She was a resident across the road," she added. "I believe she passed in '92. The priest nodded slowly. "Yes, we keep some memorial logs. If there was a service, it should be here." It took nearly an hour of quiet sifting before Ellen found what she hadn't even known to look for. There, between births and baptisms, was a slim brown envelope, unsealed and yellowing. Inside was a note addressed to the man at the bench. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the page. The handwriting was loose, the ink smudged in places but legible. "Charles, if you ever read this, it means I wasn't brave enough to say it to your face. I remembered you. I always did. They told me I was confused, that it was safer not to dig too deep. But every Thursday I heard the train, and I thought of you. I'm sorry I didn't come. I was scared you wouldn't forgive me for choosing to stay. But I never forgot our bench. You kept your promise, didn't you? I hope I get to see you once more." Ellen stood still for a long time, her throat tightened. All this time Agnes had remembered Charles hadn't been waiting in vain. He had been honoring a memory that had in fact remembered him back, but the deeper twist was yet to come. The priest, who had remained respectfully quiet, stepped closer and said, "There's something else. Agnes left behind a parcel. It was never collected. Would you like to see it?" Ellen could only nod. The box was small, tied with string. Inside was a scarf, navy blue, still faintly scented with lavender, and a letter addressed not to Charles but to her. She opened it slowly, "To the woman who's kind enough to care. If Charles is gone and you found this, then I suspect you've sat on the bench. Maybe you wondered why he never gave up. The truth is, neither did I. We were never meant to last in the ordinary sense. We had a few weeks and a plan and a promise, but promises, when real, don't die with time, they wait. He kept my name alive, and I hope in his way, he helped you keep something alive too. Don't waste your Thursdays, love. Find someone who'll sit beside you. With all my heart, Agnes." That was the moment Ellen broke. It wasn't a loud collapse, but a quiet one, like a tide pulling back, exposing everything she'd buried. The child she had lost. The partner who had grown distant, then disappeared. The decades of silence stitched into her bones. She left the church in a haze. The days that followed blurred together. Ellen stopped going to the cafe, stopped watching the trains. She felt unmoored, like the truth had undone her. More than the questions ever did, Charles had known all along. Known that Agnes remembered, that their connection hadn't died in the care home or in the silence, and still he had said nothing, not even to her. For days, Ellen vacillated between anger and awe. How could he carry that weight and keep it hidden? And why had he involved her at all? But deep down she knew. Because kindness isn't always about answers. Sometimes it's about giving someone a piece of your story so they know they're not the only one who lived through a silence. The final Thursday of the year arrived under soft snow. The platform was quieter than usual. Ellen arrived early. She sat on the bench, the notebook in her lap, the blue scarf wrapped around her neck. The empty seat beside her no longer felt empty, it felt kept as the 0940 train approached. She stood. For the first time, she stepped aboard. Not to run, not to chase ghosts, but because she had a destination. The train rolled along the coast, sea on one side, hills on the other. At the next stop, a boy and his grandmother boarded. The child looked at Ellen, then at the empty seat. "Is someone sitting there?" he asked. Ellen smiled. "Yes," she said, "but you're welcome to join us." The boy beamed and climbed into the seat. His grandmother mouthed a thank you. As the train moved on, Ellen looked out at the sea and felt for the first time in years not alone. Not unfinished, Charles had left her a question. Agnes had left her an answer, and now at last she understood the meaning of 2 tickets. Ellen took the train again the following Thursday. This time there was no notebook in her hands, no scarf tucked in her coat pocket, just her a warm flask of tea and a ticket folded into 2. Old habits, she thought, some take longer to let go than others. She didn't know why she chose the same carriage, the same seat. Maybe it was comfort, or maybe it was memory, stubborn in the way it loops back to where it once felt held. The train moved steadily along the coast, the view outside blurring into gentle shades of gray and blue. Across from her, a young couple sat whispering, their fingers brushing occasionally, but never quite resting. A woman behind her was knitting, the soft rhythm of needles clicking like a clock that didn't rush. Ellen closed her eyes for a moment and breathed. She wasn't looking for anything anymore, not answers, not redemption. What she found on that bench wasn't a grand revelation, but a quiet kind of clarity that some people keep showing up, not to hold on, but to let go with grace. That was Charles's gift. Not the waiting, but the way he waited with dignity, without bitterness. His 2 tickets had never been about hoping she'd return. They had always been about making sure she had a place should she ever want it. And maybe that's what we all need in the end. Not fireworks, not final words, just the knowledge that someone once made space for us, that our absence didn't make us invisible. Ellen continued to ride the 0940 every Thursday. Sometimes she sat alone. Sometimes someone sat beside her. Once a little girl asked if the seat next to her was free, and Ellen smiled and said, "It's always been saved for someone just like you," she never explained. She didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the story itself, but the way it had softened her. She called her brother that spring for the first time in 12 years. The conversation was awkward, meandering, full of pauses, but it happened, and that Ellen decided was enough. She sent a postcard blank on the front, save for a sketch of a seaside bench, to an old friend she hadn't spoken to since the funeral. On the back she wrote, "Still Thursday. Still here, thought of you somewhere along the way." The sharp ache in her chest dulled into something warmer. Not quite joy, but something that knew how to breathe again. The station cafe started reserving her usual table without asking. The girl behind the counter began remembering how she took her tea. And every now and then, someone would ask what she was writing in that little brown notebook she carried, not Charles's, but one of her own. She never gave a straight answer, but she always looked up, smiled and said, "Just stories, the kind that stay with you." And in her quiet way, Ellen had become part of the station too. Another figure in the backdrop, another keeper of time and tenderness. Not everyone noticed, but those who did never quite forgot her. Because sometimes the kindest people don't change the world loudly. They simply keep the bench warm. Some seats in life are never truly empty. They're just quietly waiting for someone to come back and fill them with meaning. If there's someone you still keep a silent space for, or someone who once did the same for you, you can leave a 1 below only if it feels right. And if you'd like to hear the next story, you're gently welcome to subscribe and turn on notifications, like returning to the same bench each week, hoping a familiar warmth might still be waiting there.